But in broadening culture out, something has also got lost, and that is the idea that is now very popular, that Bob Dylan is just as good a poet as Keats. And finally, Keats is a better poet than Bob Dylan. So that people are now very confused about what culture is at all, and whether there are such things as standards in culture, or whether...
When David Hare appeared on The Late Show last year, he talked about his new play, about the state of British culture, and the way that television arts programmes both shape and reflect it. But it was his unapologetic ranking of Keats above Dylan that attracted such immediate and polarised reaction.
At a conservative guess, I'd say that Keats's poems are about a million times better than Bob Dylan's, and you can make qualitative judgments. They're not just different, they're better. They stood the test of time, and they will stand the test of time.
When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-pilot books in character holes like which garners the full-ripened grain.
Anybody who reads the lyrics of Dylan hoping that they'll get Keats is in for a shock. But to say that you can't have both is a ridiculous choice.
To kill with no pain, like a dog on a chain. He ain't got no name, but it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game.
I could take the Grecian urn. I could explain this does unique things with the English language. It thinks at a depth about why we should bother with art at all, and what the relation of that is to life and death, which most other works, not only Dylan, don't.
Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink.
I think it's deeply ironic that Keats, of all people, should be held up as a kind of glowing instance of canonical virtue and absolute value, because if you look at the history of Keats's reputation, I mean, the quite savage attacks by some other romantics on him, the sense that he was a cockney upstart from nowhere, that his work was vulgar, lascivious, that his sensuality was dangerous. I mean, Keats in his own time was the centre of a maelstrom of controversy.
The barrage of comment that greeted Hare's remark soon demonstrated that more was at stake here than just personal preferences in poetry.
The pretensions of popular culture are more of a menace than the snobberies of high culture. The money is all with popular culture.
Bob Dylan is an artist not better or worse than Keats, and without question serious, demanding, and dealing with eternal verities.
It is time for the elitists to stand up and be counted. No more apologizing, no more indulging popular taste. Keats rules, okay?
It was reported that Hare had been stopped in the street and congratulated for his defence of the artistic canon, whilst his critics accused him of an elitist backlash against the cultural expansion of the last 20 years. Behind the figures of the romantic and the rocker, a deeper debate was being conducted, a debate about culture's meaning, authority, and above all, about its value.
That he needs to assert at all that he thinks Keats is a better poet than Dylan seems to me to indicate that the value system that would have enshrined Keats as a master is clearly breaking up. And so our argument really is not about Keats or Dylan, but really about the values that would have made one seem more important than the other.
Over the last 100 years, artists of all sorts and in many disciplines have claimed the right to be far more comprehensively inclusive. Whether it's Picasso bringing in oceanic art, whether it's songwriters deciding to take up very, very popular themes, or as it were the muse of melody moving to pop and moving away from classical music. And it's created new patterns which you can't simply say, I'd like it to be steam engines.
One of the marvellous things that's happened since the war is that the straight male white world and its values and its decisions about who and what is important and what goes have clearly broken up. You cannot appeal to leavists anymore because somebody else will appeal to Otis Redding.
And that is precisely the problem. In such an arena of competing authorities, how can anyone be sure where value lies? Identify what is high or low, or recognize what is good, or what is not. To throw some light on the present confusion, it's worth exploring how we got here, to trace some of the ways in which artistic certainty has been whittled away by a series of challenges to the accepted canon.
What we have to do is to step back and say, why is it that in just the same historical moment, there's a whole group of very vociferous people over here who feel that it's the end of civilization as we know it if we don't say that Keats or whoever is eternally and unquestionably superior to somebody else. And on the other hand, you seem to have a bunch of people who are saying, what does it matter anyway? Value is simply whatever I now get pleasure out of.
In the immediate post-war years, everything seemed more assured. The mission wasn't to redefine what art was or who it was for, but simply to expand its reach.
After the war, people felt that things had to be different from before in the 30s, and there was no going back to the old way of life. And this meant that the good things of life had to be shared for everybody, and obviously we know this meant healthcare and social security and education and things. And along with that went the idea that the arts also should be for everybody. What's so striking looking back is that when people thought about that, they didn't really think about what arts these were supposed to be. So in many ways, the same notion of the arts that was inherited from before the war was then recycled as culture for everybody, which was then supposed to be shared. And the Arts Council and the extension of secondary education in the universities and the BBC third programme were all conceived in this sense as a way of making the good culture, which really had been a leisure class culture before, the culture of everybody.
I am highbrow. I can quote liberally from the works of Keats, and as a result of breeding and education, my sensibilities are finely attuned to the appreciation of poetic nuance. I look down on him.
I am middlebrow. Being denied his advantages, I'm ashamed to admit that Keats doesn't do much for me. What I call a rattling good read is something by Raymond Chandler. So I look up to him, and I look down on him.
Biffard. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk.
I needed a stiff drink, a hot bath, and 12 hours sleep, in that order.
Biffard.
The Director General of the BBC, when the third programme was founded, said that his idea was that people would progress from the Light programme, which is roughly Radio 2 now, through the Home Service, which is roughly Radio 4 now, and so would all arrive at the third programme eventually. The others would sort of wither away like the state in Marxist theory, and everybody would be left listening to the third programme all the time. Whereas in fact, of course, the third programme immediately became, for a tiny minority, I mean so small they couldn't even record it in the assessments of audiences, and stayed like that.
Let us contemplate this aerial trio, home, light, third. The home I always visualize as the father of a family. But he's very fair-minded, he likes music, and he's anxious that all his listeners should have something to enjoy, provided they are not criminals or cranks. The light I visualize as an eternal debutante. She is also the dominant partner. She commands a far larger public than the home. And how do I visualize the third? Well, two faces, one of them gazing with tranquility into the past, the other with ardor into the future.
But the belief in gradual cultural progression embodied by 40s radio was soon challenged by a medium with far more aggressively populist tendencies, television.
The cultural elitists, before television, before the media, before the mass media really emerged, were seeing the early emergence of the media, I'm thinking of people like Leavis and so on, as the utter catastrophe. This would be the fall. It would be the widespread dissemination in a completely open and unguarded way of culture to people who either couldn't accept it or in some way didn't deserve it.
One of the greatest achievements, I think, of television, which the tabloid press has not achieved, because it has segmented an audience and it addresses itself to different educational groups in a country which is as stratified and class-ridden as Britain's, was
to have forged a language which is understood by the school leaver of 16 and is not despised by the university graduate.
Early apprehension about television's cultural role turned out to be unfounded. There was little evidence of any lack of commitment to quality art. The setting up of the news and current affairs strands, Tonight in Panorama, in the late 50s, was followed soon after by a programme that delivered its cultural judgments with the same confident authority.
Our programme tonight is about two men, both of them remarkable, both of them American. The one, Leonard Bernstein, the other, Paddy Chayefsky.
But questions were being asked about the relationship between broadcast culture and its audience. What did it have to say to those born outside the classes who had traditionally consumed high art? And what did its standards imply about the value of their ordinary, everyday lives? One of the first intellectuals to explore such issues was Raymond Williams, a professor of English at Cambridge.
It was an attempt by Williams to shift the whole ground of the argument from one meaning of the word culture to another. The word culture had traditionally meant the body of the arts and intellectual work. Williams went on believing in that, but he was concerned to explore the relation between that meaning of culture and a much wider, if you like, anthropological meaning of culture, basically meaning the things that ordinary people do, ordinary history and practices and institutions. Williams was concerned that there should be some connection between those two different meanings of culture. So he was at once, in a sense, a sociologist of culture. He was broadening the whole term, but he went on looking quite specifically at works of art as well. He was exploring the relations between them.
We should not seek to extend a ready-made culture to the benighted masses. We should accept, frankly, that if we extend our culture, we shall change it. Some that is offered will be rejected, other parts will be radically criticized. To take our art to new audiences is to be quite certain that in many respects those arts will be changed. I, for one, do not fear this. I would not expect the working people of England to support works which, after proper and patient preparation, they could not accept.
Another pioneer of cultural studies was Richard Hoggart. He too stressed the need for a sympathetic engagement with working-class culture, but with an important proviso.
I was prepared to encourage students to take up the study of popular culture, not to say, 1,000 times not to say, they're all as good as each other, they're relativists, so populist, but to say there is here something of interest. So long as you keep very severely intellectual and imaginative towards it, just carefully look at it.
But the working-class culture that Hoggart had chronicled was itself in retreat, under pressure from the flood of new consumer products, fashions, movies and records, eagerly enjoyed by those who could afford them, who had little concern about the cultural status of their pleasures. It was not for this that the pioneers had sought to expand the meaning of culture.
Insofar as there were good things going on, people did have some more money, they all seemed to be chasing after nasty, vulgar things and wasting their money on pop music and things. So the culture that was being delivered by welfare capitalism seemed an inferior sort of culture. And spectacularly, of course, it was said to be inferior to the kinds of working class culture that had been before, where people have been much more, allegedly have been much more involved in community and face-to-face relations and have been singing songs that meant something to them as it was understood, as opposed to Tin Pan Alley drool, as I think Richard Hoggart called it, in the uses of literacy.
By the early 60s, the relationship between popular culture and high art was dominated by the question, how far can you go? Pop art, with its deliberate confusion between high and low, only increased anxieties among those uneasy with the popular.
Good evening. Our programme tonight consists of one single film that we've made about 4 young artists. They're 4 painters who turn for their subject matter to the world of pop art, the world of the popular imagination, the world of film stars, the twist, science fiction, pop singers. A world which you can dismiss if you feel so inclined, of course, as being tawdry and second-rate, but a world all the same, in which everybody, to some degree anyway, lives, whether we like
artistic values. Not only was it hugely popular, it was also confident of its ability to deliver where the canon was thought to be weakest, in terms of energy, passion, and its own inventiveness.
Insofar as one knows anything, in the mid-60s, an enormous amount of talent went into what was once rather thought of as rather trivial pop music. An enormous amount of serious talent, musical, melodic, of course, and in music mainly melodic, but also to do with lyrics, the adaptation of lyrics, the picking up what was happening around, a lot of things that poets have often done, novelists have often done, just talent was there, it is undeniable. Now what do you do about that? You say, it's merely pop music? Do you say, let's forget about it? Or do you say, this is very interesting, that's where the energy is?
The door burst open, a young producer came in and said, I've got the Beatles, and I've got to have money immediately to film the Beatles. They are the greatest songwriters since Schubert. Now, I was born in Vienna, and I had a certain appreciation of Schubert, and I was slightly doubtful, and still to this day, is whether the songs of the Beatles, good though they are, really are as good as that.
The young director, Tony Palmer, got his money and made a film that would have been unthinkable 10 years before. Pop was claiming for itself and often winning both critical approval and cultural authority.
There are those who demand that pop music is nothing but the grotesque mumblings of a drug-sodden youth. Others, that it is making possible the most startling artistic upheaval since the Renaissance. Above all, it cares about love. But love, penetrating though it is, penetrates only to possibilities and not to facts. Thus, alas, we go step by step into the darkness. The only truth is the movement.
Along the way, pop stars even started to take on the trappings of high culture.
Okay. I just want to say something that was written by Shelley, and I think it goes with what happened to Brian. Peace. Peace. He is not dead. He does not sleep. He has awakened from the dreams of life. It's
revolution trip. You know, like Shelley and Leigh Hunt, you know, like none of this what can a poor boy do head thing. He was actually out there doing something about these social and political bummers of the early 19th century. So I don't want to put anyone down, you know, but is this straight for real or what?
What I call a rattling good read is something by Raymond Chandler. And I don't look up to him anymore because he talks rubbish and needs a haircut. But on the other hand, I can't look down on him anymore because
I was at school with John Lennon.
By the late 60s, the challenge to authority, both political and cultural, was at its height. It was perhaps no surprise then that this was the time when the BBC produced what still remains the most ambitious and most lavish account of the history of European culture ever made. Civilization ran for 13 weeks, its presenter, Kenneth Clark, making a sustained case for the survival of the great tradition as embodied in the high arts of the West.
Looking at those great works of Western man, and remembering all that he's achieved in philosophy, poetry, science, lawmaking, it does seem hard to believe that European civilization can ever vanish. And yet, you know, it has happened once. All the life-giving human activities that we lump together under the word civilization have been obliterated once in Western Europe, when the barbarians ran over the Roman Empire. For 2 centuries, the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating. We got through by the skin of our teeth.
Of course, it was an incorrect title. When it was put out in Japan, the Japanese called it Some Aspects of European Culture, and that is precisely what it was. But that, again, was not something that was going to get people turning on every night at 9 o'clock for 13 weeks.
But for all the confidence of his tone, Clark can still be heard worrying away at the issues that had penetrated even the heart of civilization itself. Whose culture is it anyway? And does it matter?
This was one of the weaknesses of Renaissance civilization. And the other, no less obviously, was that it depended on a very small minority. Even in Republican Florence, the Renaissance touched relatively few people. And in places like Urbino and Mantua, it was practically confined to the court. This is contrary to our modern sense of equality. But one can't help wondering how far civilization would have evolved if it had been entirely dependent on the popular will.
3 years later, John Berger's ways of seeing mounted a direct challenge to the values civilization had sought to defend. For Berger, art had no claims to be exempt from the material world. The canon was as compromised as any other man-made product.
Those who write about art, or talk or teach about it, often raise art above life, turning it into a kind of religion. In the first of these programs, I tried to show how and why modern methods of reproduction and communication, like color photography, like television, have theoretically changed the meaning of the visual art of the past, demystifying it and making it secular. But mostly those who use these new methods of reproduction and communication, those who write books or make television programs about art, tend to cling to the old approach. Art remains something sacred. A love of art seems automatically to be offered as a sublime human experience.
Ways of seeing was hugely influential, encouraging a generation to seek meaning and understanding in all the products a culture made.
It shows you that if your inquiry is intelligent, then you can find value in many things, you know, and that asking questions is critically important. And to that extent, the question of how popular culture can cohabit with high culture, if we say, and I think that's a perfectly proper thing to say. I think they should cohabit, and I think there's always been this problem. And mischievously, at various times, and certainly in my time as a program maker in the 70s, I felt that the kind of ritual of paying obeisance to high culture, the Mandarin view, was something that needed a kick up the arse on occasions.
670 it's going at 670 pound, I sell it at 670. At 670, a household name at 670, the 14 at 670. At 670, we've all had happy days and happy memories of these. You won't see another one like that.
Who is a design expert who's organising an exhibition on the Cortina next year?
Stephen Bailey.
Correct. There was actually an age before the Cortina, although it seems incredible for us to realise that now. And it's almost 20 years since this product was launched onto an eager British public.
This is the performance story of Ford of Britain's newest entry in the small car market. Watch the performance of a small car with
Arena gave subjects like the Ford Cortina and the song My Way a level of serious consideration usually reserved for high art. Throughout the 70s, writers and academics sought to do much the same, to expand the definition of culture by calling in the popular to counterbalance the canon. Such works proliferated, but the question of value remained.
You then have a kind of crude, what I call the proletarian appeal, which says anything that's popular really is good. And it has the enormous weakness that you just end up uncritically celebrating everything. You then get, I think, what I would call the structuralist take on this, where you suddenly try and get out of value altogether. And you say, well, everything is a complicated signifying system, and I'm going to take anything, be it a pornographic film, a Browning poem, a television program, and I'm simply going to analyze how they work. That simply ignores, it has some interesting results, but it ignores many of the most pertinent critical questions.
There was a brief period in the 1970s with the growth of cultural studies and cultural politics where people began for provisional reasons to suspend value judgments. Again, they were reacting against an approach to culture that was too heavily weighted in terms of is this the best or the worst or whatever. And it was necessary in order to make headway to suspend those values.
There was also a sort of, in the 1960s and 70s, a political movement to destroy the canon as a concept, which was quite different from the movement of teachers and writers and thinkers shifting about the perimeters of the canon. And the canon was to be destroyed partly because the word establishment became anathema, partly because the word elite became anathema, and partly because it was felt that the works that most people thought were in the canon were not accessible to the generality of people, either in schools or in the general public. What this resulted in was the building of what George Steiner distinguishes from a canon, which is a syllabus. A syllabus is, as he points out, or a curriculum, a politically constructed thing made by educators, or made by television producers, or made by the governors of the BBC. It is those things which it is thought proper by somebody for other people to be interested in.
Whether our statement is conscious or instinctive, it will serve to reaffirm our rejection of the dominant culture and its attempted negation of our way of life. So any act of cultural defiance or ideological independence, whether it be through song, dance, our use of language, the way we style our hair, our dress, our view of the world, a painting or a poem, testifies to our existence outside the roles in which British society has cast us.
We are now in an age of relativism, morally, culturally and politically, whether you like it or not. There isn't any firm place to stand. And this seems to me to be rather a good thing, rather a democratic thing in one sense, in that the old hierarchies and the old values no longer apply, because they were always used to exclude you anyway. You know, blacks, gays, women, all kinds of weirdos on the fringes now are saying, me too, sir, I'm here, I'm alive, I believe in things, I express myself, I'm an artist too. And it's very frightening for the straight white male world, because they're being flushed down the toilet by history, and good thing too.
So you have a series of questions posed to the traditional canon, which are completely in themselves valuable, but don't provide by themselves another criteria of value. I mean, they might seem to. You think anything that's working class is good, anything that's by a woman is good, anything that's by a non-Western, non-modern person is good, but that, while it has a certain moment when it can enable you to appreciate things, doesn't last very long. And then you want to find ways of saying, well, look, what is good in all this? How do we judge it? And of course, it is true that every day in our daily conversation, we are making those discriminations, and they're important for two reasons. Banally, because we haven't time to look at everything. So you ask someone, shall I go to this film? Shall I read this book? Shall I listen to this record? Because you haven't got time. But more importantly, because if one's looking at contemporary art, the most interesting of it is going to be providing questions to you which are of great importance, and of which actually deciding whether it's good or not is very important.
Searching for value, making judgments. The desire to choose doesn't go away. But has it become harder when there's simply so much to choose from? Has cultural saturation resulted in cultural stagnation?
The crisis there is, how can art still exist in a world of postmodern pick-and-mix culture? Because if you have a political relationship to art, you must be trying to address a broad section of the population in a way that is helpful and illuminating. How can you do that in a world where the media instantly trivializes, instantly fragments, instantly transforms what might seem like serious ideas into pieces of consumer culture?
But perhaps it's more than just a question of quantity of information. It may be that what we're encountering is something quite different. A new way of looking at the world in which all the old certainties are reduced to competing fragments. What's known as the postmodern condition.
Listen, I don't mind being the projectionist, but don't forget, no one's paying me to be the censor.
Over 1,000 journalists from around the world recorded the event that would become instant history.
In fact, the very phrase postmodern culture seems to be a contradiction in terms.
Yes, you've made your point very well.
Is a bloody charade.
Because culture was always about evaluating, classifying, making hierarchy, making preferences, and having predilections for one against the other, and so on. Culture was always about choosing. Culture always assumed that there's a choice. But at the same time, the very idea of culture assumes that not all choices are equivalent. There are better choices and worse choices. And that you can go on and on towards better and better choices all the time, precisely because you know what is the best of what there is already, and therefore starting from this baseline, the starting point, you can go forward. You know where forward is and where backward is. You know the directions. Now, that's why it's so strange to speak about postmodern culture, simply because postmodern mentality misses precisely this crucial constitutive aspect of any culture, the ability to pass judgment.
It's a mosaic culture. I think a better image is a kaleidoscope. The great thing about a kaleidoscope is there's no real top and bottom. It's a kind of mixture of different tastes and values. And that image, I think, is much closer to reality than the clean white pyramid with things coming down from the top. They come up really from the bottom and from the sides.
The word.
The important thing is to define what the culture is. Nowadays, the word is used so loosely that 5 youngsters smoking reefers and sitting on a wall and watching joyriders is called a culture. Now, I find that very difficult to absorb.
Listen, highbrow, lowbrow, what do those terms actually mean? At the moment, I'm writing a postmodernist, neo-structuralist novel in which John Keats time travels and becomes a seminal rapper. And as far as Chandler's concerned, I love Chandler in an ironic, retro sort of way. And this week in my home studio, I've been sampling some of that old Dylan stuff and remixing it into a sort of electro-funk, brick, shithouse, trash, thrash, flash, rehash. But I still look down on him.
What I call a rattling good read is something by Raymond Chandler. I am a monstrous carbuncle.
Hi, I'm a commissioning editor for arts programs. I look down on everybody, but hey, that's your job description. Let's do lunch. We're planning this program. Biffo the Bear is a sort of cultural icon. Interesting? Interesting. Yeah, great.
So how can we conclude? It's clear that David Hare's defence of Keats and the cultural certainties he represents are part of a deeply felt and widely shared desire to reassert the importance of acknowledged artistic worth. But Hare isn't alone in this search for cultural value. Everyone, it would seem, is at it. It's just a question of where you choose to look. Some hunt for it in the great tradition, others in the postmodern culture of fragmentation. Keats versus Dylan. The debate goes on.
As soon as this kind of pluralism exists, different kinds of groups try to claim the center, try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But frankly, we've entered into an irreversible set of splits. And you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. He doesn't want to go back. And there is no golden age to go back to, in effect.
There's been a tremendous wish to pull down a cultural fabric. You could say because Lord Clark of Civilization too complacently, speaking from a kind of stately home culture, arrogated to it Michelangelo and Titian and various great artists. But I think that it's very dangerous if you then say, let's get rid of all that. And what do we talk about? Well, back in the 80s, it was bus tickets, it was beer mats. Now I believe it's decoding phone books. And what's forgotten about is that art is joy, art is love. It's a sensual and sensuous formal existence that you're being taken into very, very briefly.
I understand that a lot of people faced with this waterfall of information, faced with what they see as an excessive experimentation, what they see as that, would like there to be categories, would like there to be hierarchies. I would like there to be hierarchies. I'm sure you would like there to be hierarchies. Life's easier.
Out of that plural reality, there's an extraordinary potential for creating new things which have their own integrity. And that integrity consists in acknowledging difference. It's the voice that's both in the establishment and outside, contesting. It's the opposition of these voices which makes the world go round and which is really to do with quality. Difference, that's what life is about.
We live in a world where any kind of culture that we require is available at the press of a button. That changes everything.
I don't think it's any more difficult to assess now than it was in 1960 or in 1930 or in 1860. Cultural value is assessed by study, by education, by critical method, And you're kidding yourself if you think that somehow it's more tricky now in 1990, just because there's more information and more of it about, as you might say, than there used to be.
Are we going to take our own traditional culture simply as its inheritors, or do we have to question it? And then it seems to me incontrovertible that we can't simply take it on its own terms. It's part of the more general question of how we're to understand our own culture, and how, above all, we're to understand the relation of Western culture to the rest of the globe, which for 300 years we've dominated. Those movements, important as they are, have now suddenly run up against a political reality, a geopolitical reality, in which, you know, ideas are so far behind reality that you turn on your, you know, we turned on our television last week and we learned the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. We turn on, I mean, and in the face of that kind of shock, one of the things you're going to look for is much, along with a degree of certainty elsewhere, but if you can't find it elsewhere, is in your artistic judgments.
Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. Silent upon a peak in Darien,